Find yourself grappling with great literature or classic literature or whatever I try to talk about on this page, you're going to find authors writing intense moments of emotion in their characters, scenes that carry a lot of emotional weight, and they're going to accomplish this in a couple different ways. I initially wanted to make this just talking about how the French writers I've encountered do it and how Russian writers have done it, but I think there's a lot more nuance to it than that. So I'm going to go through a couple examples of how I think some of the great writers approach moments of really intense emotion in their characters. And I'm going to start with my least favorite, which is Dostoevsky. When I was reading The Brothers Karamazov at the beginning of 2025, I was just so bored of all the times the characters are bursting into tears, always bursting into tears, or falling on the floor because they're so stricken with emotion, grabbing at somebody's feet. It was just crazy. I know that Dostoevsky is someone known for this fever pitch of emotion, positive and negative, but I think it felt like an especially egregious literary crime to me, not because it was so extreme at every moment, but because it made the characters less realistic. People emote in shades of gray and not in black and white, so I found that just sort of ridiculous, and it contributed to my ultimate not total enjoyment of The Brothers Karamazov. And then my favorite, probably at least along the French and Russian continuum that I initially and erroneously planned this video around, is Maupassant, Guy de Maupassant. I do like his short stories, but I was really impressed by Faux comme la mort, which Richard Howard translated as Like Death. That's a novel of his. What he does is sketching out a scene artfully, pacing everything really well, displaying the characters' internal thoughts and emotions, and then combining that with what they actually say. So those three factors taken as a piece, I think Maupassant is excellent at. I'm going to include a few others also. Turgenev, I was very impressed with his short stories. I have a video on here where I read a selection from First Love. I was just really blown away by that story. But Fathers and Sons, which is sort of hailed as his classic, I was not very moved by. I had a difficult time tracking emotionally where characters were and how invested I was, which I guess means I wasn't very invested at all. Another great book I really enjoy that certainly has its moments where emotion hits a fever pitch is Madame Bovary, Flaubert. I think what works there is characters are acting out prescribed roles in sort of a larger set piece constructed by Flaubert's famous precision. I think in Madame Bovary, especially with Emma herself, that works very well. I also wasn't very impressed with his other novel, Sentimental Education. But I think the reason that I wasn't very engaged, characters just seemed sort of dry and they weren't really operating with the same kind of emotional force or power, is because they are going through a cycle of disillusionment and ultimately sort of psychological ruin, which is part of the point of the novel. Tolstoy, I'm going through Anna Karenina right now, which I like quite a bit. And I will say The Death of Ivan Ilyich, which I also have a video about on here. Not so much the emotion of the characters themselves, but the overwhelming, terrifying, shattering pathos of the circumstances that the protagonist is going through are certainly compelling enough. And of course, it's the same journey that we all have to go through of approaching death. There's obviously a lot more to be said here, and I want to keep this video fairly short. I think anyone making this point would do well to include writers from other countries, female authors. Maybe I'll do that very quickly with Middlemarch, which I also finished recently. There, I thought that characters failing to overhear themselves when expressing their different versions of strong emotions I found very interesting. And often the circumstances that George Eliot is constructing around especially characters like Mr. Casaubon, who is sort of a tragic figure in his own right, but also someone that you could and should and must laugh at. Other characters are included in that category as well. Really interesting way of overhearing him failing to notice sort of the ridiculous nature, the pathetic nature of what he's feeling in a given moment. There's a whole lot more to be said here, so what do you think?